On the night of June 20th, 1947, a man sat on a chintz sofa in a rented Beverly Hills mansion, reading the Los Angeles Times. 9 rounds from a military carbine tore through the window behind him. 2 hit his head. He was dead before the paper hit the floor. The house belonged to Virginia Hill. She wasn't home. She'd flown to Paris 10 days earlier, supposedly to buy wine for a hotel that wasn't even finished yet. The timing was so convenient that federal investigators spent the next 4 years trying to prove she'd known exactly what was coming. She never told them. She never really told anyone, not even the men who loved her enough to kill for her or die for her, sometimes in the same year. Ben Siegel is the name most people remember. Bugsy, if you want the nickname he hated enough to punch people over. He built the Flamingo out of raw desert and got shot for running $6 million over budget doing it. His story gets the museum plaques and the Warren Beatty movie. Virginia Hill gets a footnote, the girlfriend, the one whose legs supposedly named a casino. That's backwards. By the time Siegel died, Hill had already run money for 3 different crime families across 2 continents and survived at least 1 suicide attempt. She would go on to testify in front of a room full of United States senators, marry a ski instructor, raise a son alone in the Alps, and die under circumstances nobody has ever fully explained. This is the story of 2 people who loved each other badly, and how one of them kept paying for it for 19 years, after the other was already in the ground. If stories like this one, the ones that sit underneath the Vegas mythology most people already know, are your kind of thing, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs nothing. Now back to Alabama, because that's genuinely where all of this starts. Virginia Hill was born in 1916 in Lipscomb, Alabama, one of 10 children. Her father traded horses and drank. Her mother eventually packed up the kids and moved them to Marietta, Georgia, leaving him behind. Nobody in that house had money, and nobody pretended otherwise. By her teens, Virginia was already gone from home in every way that mattered. Some accounts have her married as young as 14, a detail her later biographers treat with real skepticism, since most of what's known about her early years comes from Hill's own retellings, and Hill was never a reliable narrator of her own life. What's consistent across the record is the direction she was moving, out, fast, alone if she had to be. She left the South for Chicago in the early 1930s with almost nothing. The city was mid-collapse economically, deep in the Depression, and also mid-spectacle, gearing up to host the 1933 World's Fair. Virginia found work there as a waitress, and depending on which account you trust, occasionally as something closer to an escort for the men passing through with money to spend. She was 17. She was already learning a skill that would define the rest of her life, how to become exactly what a particular man in the room wanted, for exactly as long as it benefited her. Chicago in the 1930s was Capone's Chicago, or what was left of it after his conviction. The outfit still ran the city's rackets, even with its most famous boss in a federal cell, and a young woman with Hill's looks and nerve didn't stay invisible to that world for long. She caught the attention of a bookmaker connected to the organization, who gave her a nickname that would follow her the rest of her life, the Flamingo, for her long legs. Whether it started as a compliment or a joke depends on who's telling the story. Either way, it stuck for 30 years and eventually got attached to a hotel. She started running errands for the mob, small ones at first, then bigger ones. This is the part of Virginia Hill's story people tend to skip past on their way to Siegel, and it's the part that actually explains her. She wasn't a starlet who happened to fall for a gangster. She was already a courier, a fixer, and by some accounts a money launderer for organized crime, years before Bugsy Siegel ever said hello to her. She moved cash between cities, in amounts that would have gotten most people arrested on sight. She fixed racetrack odds. She carried messages nobody wanted written down, memorized instead of printed, delivered in person instead of by wire. One trip to Mexico in the 1930s reportedly helped establish smuggling routes that outlasted her involvement in them entirely. None of this made the papers at the time. It couldn't. That was the point of her. A pretty woman with a southern accent and expensive clothes moved through hotel lobbies and train stations in a way that armed men in suits never could, unremarked, unsearched, waved through by doormen who had no idea what was folded into her handbag. She was, in other words, already somebody in that world, not somebody's girlfriend, somebody. By the late 1930s, she'd relocated to New York and fallen in with Joe Adonis, one of the most powerful men in the Genovese crime family's orbit. Adonis kept her close, funded her lifestyle, and by most accounts, genuinely wanted her. Then Virginia met one of Adonis's top earners, a Brooklyn-born hitman with a violent temper and movie star looks, and she and Adonis had a problem. That earner was Benjamin Siegel. Siegel had been building his own legend for 2 decades by the time he met Hill. Born in 1906 in Brooklyn to Jewish immigrant parents, he grew up shaking down pushcart peddlers as a teenager in Williamsburg, a neighborhood split between Irish and Italian gangs, where a Jewish kid learned early that toughness wasn't optional. At 18, he partnered with a young Meyer Lansky, and together they built what the papers later called the Bugs and Meyer Gang, a crew of contract killers who eventually fed into the broader operation known as Murder, Incorporated. The nickname Bugsy came from that period too, shorthand for a man prone to going, as the old slang had it, bugs. He hated hearing it said to his face. People who valued their teeth avoided saying it there. By the time Prohibition ended, Siegel had bootlegged, extorted, and killed his way into serious standing with the East Coast Syndicate. There was even a strange detour in the late 1930s, where he traveled to Italy hoping to sell Mussolini's government a new kind of military explosive, a deal that fell apart when the demonstration itself failed to detonate properly. He moved west not long after, chasing Hollywood glamour and the looser rackets of Los Angeles. He built a mansion in Beverly Hills. He threw parties Cary Grant and Clark Gable actually showed up to, and by several accounts genuinely liked him, which says something about how well Siegel could compartmentalize a hitman's resume behind a movie star's face. He ran gambling ships anchored off the California coast, just outside the reach of local law enforcement, and pushed narcotics through the same channels that moved everything else he touched. He also had a wife, Esta Krakauer, his childhood sweetheart, married since 1929, mother of his 2 daughters. Siegel kept that marriage running in parallel with everything else for years, the way a lot of powerful men of that era did, quietly and without much apparent guilt. Then he met Virginia Hill, and Joe Adonis's girl became Ben Siegel's problem, and Adonis's problem became Virginia Hill's again a few years later when the affair reignited in Los Angeles. The two of them together were, by every account from the period, a spectacle, beautiful, violent, reckless with money and with each other. Reporters loved them because they made good copy. Mob associates feared them because Siegel's temper was real and well documented, and Hill matched it. In 1944, according to accounts collected by the Mob Museum, Siegel struck her during one of their fights, an assault serious enough that it later surfaced in law enforcement records. He was arrested that same year on an unrelated felony bookmaking charge, which the papers ran alongside gossip about the relationship, embarrassing him in front of both his wife's world and the underworld's. He beat that charge. He did not beat the exposure. Frustrated with the scrutiny in Los Angeles, Siegel started looking at a dusty railroad stop out in the Nevada desert, where gambling was legal and nobody was paying attention. Las Vegas in 1945 had almost nothing going for it. A handful of small casinos downtown, a compliant local government, and legal gambling in a state most of the country still thought of as empty. Siegel saw a gambling resort rising out of that emptiness before anyone else did, and he wanted Virginia there with him to build it. She said no at first. She'd grown to actively dislike the town before she'd even moved there, and she wasn't wrong to. What finally got her to Vegas wasn't romance. It was orders. Jack Dragna, an LA crime boss, reportedly told her to go, watch Siegel, and report back on what he was doing with the syndicate's money. She went as an operative before she went as a girlfriend, which tells you something about how blurry those two roles had already become in her life. Even the woman standing at Siegel's side in publicity photos was, underneath the mink and the smile, on somebody's payroll to watch him. Before the Flamingo, Siegel had already tested the desert with a smaller purchase, the El Cortez Hotel downtown, which he bought for around $600,000 and flipped for a modest profit. It should have been a warning sign about how his luck in Vegas would actually run. It wasn't treated as one. Siegel partnered with Hollywood reporter-publisher Billy Wilkerson, who'd already broken ground on a hotel casino called the Flamingo before running out of money mid-project. Siegel took it over, with financing arranged through the Eastern Crime Syndicate, and turned what started as a $1.5 million build into one that would eventually cost more than $6 million. Vegas in 1946 had no unions capable of enforcing a schedule, no established supply chain for a resort this size, and a small army of contractors happy to bill Siegel twice for materials that showed up once or didn't show up at all. Every dollar over budget was a dollar somebody in New York noticed, and there were a lot of dollars. Quick pause here, because this is where the money trail actually gets interesting, and where a lot of people who cover this story get lazy and skip the details. If you want the version of Vegas history that doesn't cut corners, drop a comment telling me which mob figure you want covered next. It genuinely shapes what I make. Now, back to the desert, because the walls are about to close in. Construction on the Flamingo dragged through 1946 in a mess of shortages, theft, and Siegel's own erratic management. Materials went missing. Contractors got paid twice for the same work. Rumors circulated that Siegel was skimming cash directly off the construction budget, and that Hill herself was the one moving it, carrying suitcases of money to Switzerland under the cover of buying wine for the not-yet-open hotel. Meyer Lansky, by then a senior figure in the Eastern Syndicate and Siegel's oldest friend, started asking questions his old partner couldn't answer cleanly. $2 million, by some estimates, had vanished somewhere between the construction invoices and the finished building. Lansky suspected his friend of stealing from the same men who'd financed him. That's not a business dispute you walk away from in that world. That's a death sentence with a delay on it. Siegel, undeterred or simply out of options, pushed forward with a glitzy opening weekend in December 1946 for a hotel that wasn't remotely finished. It flopped. Rain kept the celebrity guests from flying in. The casino lost money in its first weeks. It closed, reopened the following spring in better shape, and slowly started turning a profit. But by then, the damage to Siegel's standing with his financiers was already done. Through all of this, Hill and Siegel's relationship kept doing what it had always done, catching fire, burning out, reigniting. They fought constantly and violently. Some biographers describe repeated instances of Hill attempting suicide during this period, 7 attempts by some counts. A detail that gets treated as a punchline in cheaper retellings of her story, and shouldn't be. A woman running money for multiple crime families while dating one of the most dangerous men in it was not living a glamorous double life. She was living inside a pressure cooker with no way out that didn't involve betraying somebody. By early June 1947, the pressure had a deadline. Chicago associates reportedly told Hill directly to get out of Las Vegas and to tell Siegel she was going to Paris to buy wine for the Flamingos bar. She left on June 10th. Whether she knew what was coming, whether that trip was a warning she was smart enough to take, or pure coincidence she got lucky on, is a question nobody has ever definitively answered, including the federal investigators who spent years trying. 10 days later, on the evening of June 20th, 1947, Siegel was sitting in the Beverly Hills mansion he'd leased for Hill, reading the paper. A shooter outside fired through the living room window with a military carbine. 2 rounds hit Siegel in the head. He died on the sofa. He was 41. Nobody was ever charged. The consensus among historians and law enforcement of the era points toward the syndicate ordering the hit over the missing construction money, a conclusion that lines up with everything Lansky had reportedly been asking about for months. Within hours of the murder, associates of the syndicate reportedly walked into the Flamingo and calmly informed the staff that new management was taking over. That's not the behavior of an organization that was surprised. Virginia Hill was in Paris when it happened. She flew back into a storm of press coverage that painted her, depending on the outlet, as a grieving girlfriend, a co-conspirator, or both at once. Federal investigators pulled her in for questioning almost immediately, certain that a woman as plugged into the syndicate as she was must have known the hit was coming. She denied it, consistently, for the rest of her life. Whatever she knew, she kept it, and keeping it turned out to be the beginning of a much longer punishment than the one Siegel got. For the next few years, Hill kept living the way she'd always lived, moving between mob associates, running money, staying visible in a world that increasingly wanted her invisible. In 1950, she married Hans Hauser, an Austrian ski instructor who ran the ski school at Sun Valley, Idaho, and the following year she gave birth to their son, Peter. That same year, 1951, the United States Senate came looking for her. Estes Kefauver's Committee on Organized Crime had launched televised hearings that were riveting the country, and Virginia Hill, girlfriend to a murdered mob boss and courier for half of organized crime's East Coast operation, was exactly the kind of witness they wanted on camera. Her entrance to the hearing room was described by one reporter as pure Hollywood pandemonium. She arrived in a mink stole, shoved past photographers, and screamed at the press on her way in. Once seated under the lights, by several accounts, she looked genuinely frightened and asked that some of them be turned off. She testified that her money came from gifts, boyfriends who paid her because they liked her company. Time magazine, covering her later obituary, wrote that she spent her time on the stand, boggling senators with her curves and her succinct explanations of exactly why men paid for a hospitable girl from Alabama. It got laughs in the room. It also worked. She gave the committee almost nothing usable and walked out having admitted to no crime at all. The IRS wasn't as easily charmed. Investigators determined she'd spent roughly $500,000 over the years without paying tax on any of it, and in 1954, the government indicted her. She fled to Europe with Hauser and their young son, and the IRS seized and auctioned off whatever property she'd left behind in the United States. By some accounts, the FBI listed her among its most wanted for a time. That was the end of Virginia Hill's American life. She never came back. In Europe, the marriage that had briefly given her a version of normal life fell apart. She and Hauser separated, and in her final years she lived largely off whatever her teenage son, Peter, could bring in working as a waiter. The woman who once carried suitcases of syndicate cash to Swiss banks was, by the mid-1960s, broke and dependent on a kid. In March 1966, according to one account, Hill met Joe Adonis, her old flame from decades earlier, in Naples, reportedly threatening to expose old secrets unless he sent her money. She may have walked away from that meeting with $10,000 in cash. 2 days later, on March 24, 1966, her body was found outdoors, near a small brook in Koppel, a village outside Salzburg, Austria. She'd overdosed on sleeping pills and alcohol. She was 49. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, and a note reportedly indicated she was simply tired of life. Unofficially, the location of the body outdoors, in cold weather, far from any home, has fueled decades of speculation that her death wasn't as simple as the report suggested. Author Andy Edmonds, who wrote a biography of Hill in the 1990s, argued the circumstances never fully added up. Nobody has ever proven it either way. She was buried in Agen Cemetery in Salzburg, an ocean away from Alabama, an ocean away from the desert town she'd hated, and the man whose murder she outlived by 19 years. Here's what tends to get lost in the version of this story that's mostly about a casino and a nickname. Virginia Hill wasn't destroyed by Bugsy Siegel the way a bystander gets destroyed by a car crash. She was already deep in that world when she met him, capable and dangerous in her own right, and the relationship between them was closer to two people accelerating each other's worst instincts than one person ruining another. Siegel got the quick, violent ending that history books like, the kind that photographs well and fits neatly into 90 minutes of film. Hill got the slow version. 2 decades of hearings, indictments, exile, a broken marriage, and a body found alone in the Austrian cold, in a country she'd fled to because there was nowhere left in her own to hide. They destroyed each other in different tenses, him, all at once, on a sofa in a rented house, her, gradually, everywhere she went after. If you want the next one of these, the story of the woman the Kennedys tried hardest to keep quiet, or the mob wife who outlived 4 husbands and buried every secret with them, subscribe and turn on notifications, because these don't always get recommended the way they should. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.